This is the ideal Famicom software. You may not like it, but this is what peak performance looks like. It's NES Works Gaiden episode 41.
Come on.
Okay, this one isn't peak performance. Namcot's BattleCity is fine, but it's hardly the pinnacle of Famicom design. Another arcade conversion I describe BattleCity as Atari's Combat meets Warpman. You control a tank that moves through a maze of obstacles attempting to take out enemies while protecting your base from their attacks. Unlike in combat, you don't need to worry about outsmarting another human. This is a strictly solo affair. Instead, you have to outsmart a lot of enemy tanks. As in Warpman, these keep spawning until you've destroyed a set number, denoted by icons in the sidebar to the right, or until they get the better of you and use their numbers to overwhelm your tank and destroy your base. BattleCity contains a few elements that set it apart from its apparent inspirations. For starters, and most importantly, the maze in which the action takes place doesn't present hard boundaries in most spaces. Although you have to contend with 4 different kinds of scenery, including brick walls, metal barriers, water, and foliage, only barriers resist your fire, and they resist enemy fire. Brick walls, on the other hand, you can easily blast your way through. Although these walls absorb your shots, each hit you land chips away at the bricks, and firing a few shots allow you to break right on through a wall. Think Dig Dug, or perhaps more precisely Sega's Borderline, which also involved top-down military combat through spaces with destructible barriers. You don't want to go overboard blasting apart walls, of course, because then you run the risk of leaving yourself exposed to enemies with nowhere to hide. You know, kind of like the dynamic scenery that we were promised with Metal Gear Solid 4, except actually implemented in the game. As you advance through the game, you also begin to encounter water and trees. Water presents a barrier to movement, but not arms fire. Tanks can't pass through it, but your shots, and enemy shots, can sail over it to hit targets opposite. And trees create an elevated canopy that hides the location of your tank and enemy tanks while allowing you both to move around under cover. Of course, this works against you more than it does the enemy, since those tanks are all managed by the computer and don't need to worry about things like fog of war. Enemy tanks appear in several different forms, each with its own set of skills, tendencies, and aggression. Some are more likely to come directly after you by smashing up the maze, while others prefer to take the roundabout way. Although the enemy has the advantage of numbers and a full grasp of the lay of the land, even in obscured geography, the player's tank does have a few options to balance things out. Aside from the fact that human intuition is inherently cannier than reactive AI, you can also collect a variety of power-up icons that appear from time to time. These icons grant you temporary powers that even the odds. A shovel, for example, freezes all enemies briefly, while grenades work as smart bombs capable of clearing the screen. You need to collect the icons to activate them, and you only have a brief window of time before they vanish, so your play strategies need to account for the appearance and location of these stationary icons. While simple, BattleCity represents a pretty significant upgrade over the original arcade game. It also adds in a 2-player cooperative mode, as well as a level construction kit. Between the construction mode and the fact that you can choose your starting level at the game's outset, BattleCity appears to have taken some degree of inspiration from Hudson's Lode Runner conversion. The coin-op game debuted on some of Namco's earliest color-capable hardware, and it made use of simple, single-color graphical elements that moved choppily. By comparison, BattleCity features fluid movement, greater visual variety, more moving elements on screen at once, and vastly more detailed graphics. The credit for the sprite and background visual overhaul goes to none other than the late Hiroshi Dotman Ono, who effectively brought a fairly primitive-looking arcade game up to the standards of Namcot's other home releases here. I don't know that I'd call BattleCity a masterpiece, but it's a sign of things to come. An arcade adaptation that improves significantly on the original work. A nice balance between the direct arcade ports of the early Famicom days and the radical overhauls of games like Mighty Bomb Jack and Rygar that would begin to appear on Famicom in 1986. Arcade to Famicom upgrades were all well and good, but leave it to Nintendo to demonstrate the potential inherent in designing games specifically for the hardware. Like so many games we've seen so far in Famicom, Super Mario Bros. Did not begin life in arcades. On the contrary, Nintendo R&D 4 built it to take full advantage of the console's capabilities. I've already described Super Mario Bros. As the culmination of Nintendo's development efforts to this point over on NES Works. But I think seeing it in its original release context here on Famicom drives the point home even more clearly. We've seen some pretty solid games on NES Works Gaiden until now, but the console has some hard limits due to the capabilities of the system and the storage limits of the cartridges. Although Masayuki Uemura and his team at Nintendo R&D 2 developed the Famicom hardware to be extensible, the tools to take advantage of that potential hadn't yet appeared by late 1985. However, Nintendo had a project waiting in the wings that would change that, the Famicom Disk System, which would ship in February 1986. The disk system would connect to the Famicom hardware through its cartridge port, but unlike carts to this point, it would take advantage of the expansion pins in the cartridge connector to pipe in additional content powered by the disk system's additional hardware. Soon after the disk system's debut, cartridges would begin to ship with subprocessors, capable of managing the distribution of memory, which would allow games to contain more content and eventually perform feats well beyond the capabilities of the actual Famicom hardware. Here in September 1985, however, those things didn't quite exist. Everything that is shipped for the console to this point ran on what is commonly referred to as Mapper 0, which is to say the most basic cartridge hardware, with no additional technical features and a storage capacity that topped out at a few dozen kilobytes. By far the single most recurring motif in the comments for Famicom games of this era has been a common refrain. I played this game on a pirate multicart when I was a kid. The multicarts that shipped in the Famicom's later years tended to gather together dozens of these small, simple early games with small memory footprints and no need to support upgraded technical features. One of the driving goals for Nintendo in creating Super Mario Bros. Was to create the most game content possible within those limits. But you'd be hard-pressed to believe that Super Mario Bros. Doesn't contain any tech more advanced than that found in games like Galaxian or Donkey Kong, because it feels enormous. It looks great, it offers incredible controls, and ultimately sets a new standard for the design of home video games. Look what has come before Super Mario Bros. In terms of comparable works. A few games have contained more than 32 stages, like Lode Runner and the Tower of Draga, but those numerous stages looked and played identically. And in terms of platform action, forget about it. You should be familiar with Nintendo's platformer offerings from their NES releases. They were fine, but didn't begin to compare to this masterpiece. And third-party efforts have been downright rough. Think Ninja-kun, or better yet, don't. Super Mario Bros. Would unsurprisingly become one of the key reference points for gaming's future. Countless games would look to its format, mechanics, and concepts for inspiration. Just think how many subsequent games like Wonder Boy would feature 8 worlds broken into 4 stages, or have you collect 100 coins for an extra life, or that sort of thing. This represented a significant departure for Mario, too. Although he'd been a character built around running and jumping since his debut in Donkey Kong, Super Mario Bros. Transplanted those skills into a far more expansive setting than the single-screen score challenges he had previously figured into. Mario begins here in a screen essentially devoid of detail. Similar to the way Donkey Kong tossing barrels in Mario's direction prompted the player to move in that game, the absolute lack of anything to do at the outset here sends a clear message to get a move on. It doesn't take long before scenery and enemies begin to appear, with question mark blocks and bricks appearing overhead, pipes to leap over, and wandering enemies to avoid or destroy. Mario can collect upgrades that grant him newfound abilities. A Super Mushroom to give him height and allow him to survive an enemy attack. Fire Flower that gives him the ability to fling fireballs across the ground, and a Superstar that makes him briefly invincible to enemy attacks. Mario can hop on most enemies to crush or disable them, an evolution from his ability to kick inverted foes in the original Mario Bros. You can't destroy all enemies this way, but their visual design offers up some pretty intuitive clues to steer you away from monsters that pose a danger to jump on. They're the ones with pointy edges. The entire world spans 32 stages, broken into 8 worlds, and each world works in a sort of cycle. You begin with a straightforward ground-based stage before moving on to a different environment, usually an underground passage or a fragmented bridge, which leads directly into the athletic stages that involve extensive platforming over yawning, deadly chasms. Survive these tests, and you reach the fortress levels that contain surprisingly few enemies. Instead, the challenge in these levels comes mainly from the need to navigate narrow passages filled with mechanical hazards and dangerous pits of flame. At the end of each fortress, you have to outfight or outmaneuver the boss, Bowser, sort of, before being chided to go play the next stage. The legacy of Super Mario Bros. Stands on the combination of multiple elements that individually figure among the best yet seen on Famicom. The scale, the fluid control physics, the visuals, and the clever level design that feels perfectly fair and intuitive despite containing numerous hidden secrets. Bringing them all together into a single work, though, frankly, it's almost unfair to every other Famicom developer. But this once, Nintendo didn't make use of technical advantages or unique features that weren't available to other devs. Super Mario Bros. Soars simply because it's immaculately designed. A huge game packed with content, top-flight programming, and bountiful imagination. Anyone technically could have made this game, but only Nintendo did. And while Famicom and NES games would grow enormously in terms of size and complexity in the years to come, Super Mario Bros. Demonstrates just how much the basic hardware could achieve all on its own. It's an incredible accomplishment in design and tech, and it arrived just in time for the American launch of the NES, which followed a mere month later. Super Mario Bros. Came in so hot for the NES's debut, in fact, that it barely even factored into the company's early marketing for the system. Initial ads and flyers revolved almost entirely around peripheral-based games like Gyromite and Duck Hunt, and fairly basic black box creations like baseball and tennis. Don't worry though, we figured it out on our own eventually.
Will you be the one to raise the incredibly accurate zapper?
Next time on NES Works Gaiden, some games burdened with the unenviable task of following up on Super Mario Bros.